Welcome to An Honorable Profession, a podcast giving America hope since 2018. I'm Ryan Coonery. Along with Debbie Cox Bultan of the New Deal, I'm lucky enough to be your co-host. An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. The New Deal is an organization that supports the next generation of American leaders. From attorneys generals to state senators to mayors to school board members, these are the people that are pushing policies and politics that will respond to climate change, rebuild our economy, address racial injustice, and restore our democracy. These are incredibly talented people who have dedicated themselves to public service when their country and their communities needed it the most. Check out newdealleaders.org to see what I'm talking about.
Hello, listeners. I'm Rachel, the producer of An Honorable Profession. This week, I joined co-hosts Ryan Coonery and Debbie Cox Bultan on the podcast to talk about the past few months in this key election year. We kick things off talking about the Democratic National Convention last week, as well as some of the overarching themes we saw from speakers, including many New Deal leaders and alumni. The three of us also reflect on our Road to November 2024 messaging series, where Debbie and Ryan spoke with political strategists, policy experts, and state and local elected officials to gain key insights on how to talk to voters' top concerns and what Democrats can do to win up and down the ballot. As we take the time to reflect on a busy past few months, we talk about the growing momentum in the Democratic Party and what leaders at every level of government need to do to keep energy high through the fall. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to An Honorable Profession. I'm Rachel. I'm the producer of the podcast, and I'm joining Ryan and Debbie today to talk about the past few months and the conversations we've had on the podcast, in person, and most recently at the Democratic National Convention. So, as you probably know, as listeners of the podcast, we spent quite a few months this year talking to political thinkers, policy experts, and leaders on the ground in swing states, getting their insights on effective messaging strategies for this year's election. We got a lot of really great insights from them, from talking about ways to discuss the economy, freedom, reproductive freedom, public safety. But we also gained a lot of insights through the New Deal's messaging guide, which was produced as a result of a lot of these conversations, as well as in-person convenings that we held. And I think the true culmination of these conversations, these themes, these broad suggestions and ideas that Democrats should be carrying with them into November was at last week's Democratic National Convention. So we saw a lot of those themes take center stage, whether it was during Vice President Harris's remarks or remarks from various governors, senators, congresspeople. It seems like a lot of these themes that we've discussed, both in our Road to November messaging series, as well as our New Deal 2024 messaging guide and in other in-person convenings, have really taken off and are really taking the country by storm, as evidenced by the DNC last week.
Rachel, let me just start by saying it's wonderful to have you on screen, on air. You have been in the heart and soul of this podcast for years now, and to have your talents be able to be heard by all is thrilling. And I want to jump in by saying you and Debbie both just got back from the convention. Hopefully you've caught up on your sleep a little bit, but it must have been an amazing experience to see the messaging that the New Deal has been at the forefront of pushing, being mentioned from the center stage over and over again from different perspectives, but fundamentally coming back to this idea of freedom and winning the middle. Tell me how it felt to be on the floor at the convention.
Well, I'm happy to jump in. I'll echo the welcome to Rachel. Happy to have you here, Rachel. But it was, and I'll let Rachel speak for herself, of course. But for me, it was this was my sixth in-person convention, 7 if you count the virtual one we did 4 years ago. Worth noting for everybody that, of course, we did not have a convention during COVID, so it's been 8 years. There's a lot of, I think, pent-up energy about being back together in person. But, maybe worth noting here, we started this series, right, when President Biden was still on the ticket, and a lot of the conversations we had were around, thinking that he would be our nominee. So it's an interesting pivot, but it's also a really exciting pivot. I mean, part of what touched me at this convention was this passing of the torch to the vice president and to a new generation of leaders, so many of whom we hear on this podcast all the time. I mean, one of the things, my key takeaways from the convention was, and we can talk about the vice president's speeches, as Rachel said, or the current vice president, the hopefully future vice president's speeches, which were both thrilling and electric, not to mention Oprah and the Obamas, and it was an embarrassment of riches, the Clintons. I mean, it was crazy. But also for us, the people who do this work of thinking about and empowering and supporting elected officials at all levels of government, our bench is so deep, it is crazy. So, the governors that we heard from, we had several New Deal leaders on the stage, on the program. We had Cav Johnson, mayor of Milwaukee, who's been on the podcast before. We have Austin Davis, who's been on the podcast before, lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania, and others. So it was very exciting just to see, for me, the deep, and this, I want to talk about messaging. That's what we're here for. But I did want to just get that point in, that it was so exciting to hear from so many New Deal leaders who were all frankly singing off the same song sheet, including some of our alum, right? We had 2 of the 5 final vice presidential candidates being vetted were New Deal leaders. I just have to point that out. So with Josh Shapiro and Pete Buttigieg, both of whom spoke in Chicago. So I thought that everybody was really on message in thinking about the 2 things really that you said up front, which were freedom, and talking about the freedom that's at stake in this election and what Democrats are doing to expand and protect freedoms, everything from freedom of choice, which people think about, but also freedom to pursue and thrive with a job, freedom from gun violence, freedom to love who you want to love. So, I mean, just so many ways that we talked about freedom. And then also this expanding from the middle out, which we can talk about later. But I mean, all the New Deal leaders who spoke, and really, frankly, across the board, I thought it was a very disciplined convention in terms of the message. But it was exciting to be there and to be part of it. Rachel, what did you think?
Yeah, I would echo a lot of what you said, Debbie, as far as the bench being so deep. And it was amazing to see so many New Deal leaders and former podcast guests on the stage. It was super exciting. You do feel like you kind of know them personally when you see them up on that big screen, and you think that oh, we've had a conversation before on the podcast. But as far as the energy at the convention, it was amazing. I truly, back, before July 21st, before President Biden decided to pass the torch to Vice President Harris, I really didn't know what to expect from the convention. I don't think a lot of people knew what was going to happen. With Vice President Harris front and center, she just brings this energy. And it's magnified rather by the embarrassment of riches that you've talked about, the Obamas, the Clintons, Oprah, Mindy Kaling, Kerry Washington, no Beyonce, sadly, but it's, and so just being in that room and feeling that energy and feeling that momentum was really exciting. I mean, it really just was the antidote, I think, to a lot of pre-election scaries that people might be feeling. It was really you left just feeling good about November. Looking thematically, it was really awesome to see freedom take a central role in pretty much every conversation that we were having. I think that the convention did a great job drawing attention to the Project 2025 agenda that is kind of being definitely being associated with a second Trump term. They did a great job drawing a contrast between that Project 2025 agenda and a Democratic agenda focused on freedom. Debbie, as you mentioned, the freedom to be safe at school, to be safe from gun violence, to be free to marry who you want, to be free to, pursue economic opportunities, all these really great freedoms that are sometimes overlooked. It was really a reclamation of freedom, of patriotism. It was really beautiful. I mean, I think something that was almost shocking was how prominent the American flag and the USA signs were at the DNC. So often it feels like Republicans have really co-opted those images and those symbols, but they were so central to this convention and to Vice President Harris's entire agenda and platform. So it was really amazing to see this country first narrative that did not have to put other people back, right? I think with the Republicans, we have this country first narrative that really does not acknowledge people who are struggling in this country. I think Democrats really successfully put a country first agenda out there that is uplifting everybody in this country.
And I want to give you all credit because when we all started talking last winter about a freedom agenda, it wasn't entirely clear to me what that would mean and how it would resonate with American voters. But, as Simon Rosenberg pointed out on our podcast, this is something that's rooted back to FDR and, has a long tradition in democratic politics. But how did you all foresee freedom being so essential as a central narrative of this campaign going forward?
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, as you kind of alluded to, we were really proud to put out what we called the Freedom Agenda that we did in concert with the New Democrat Coalition, our kind of ideological partners in Congress, if you will, with Chairwoman Annie Kuster from New Hampshire. And a lot of what Rachel and I touched on about making the case that freedom was the theme that was running through all of these issues that Democrats were trying to, have been trying to promote for a long time. And to kind of, as Rachel mentioned, kind of reclaim this, frankly, from the Republicans who've had co-opted for many decades this idea of freedom and country and patriotism. And so we were really proud to put that out last November around our conference in Washington, D.C. Last year. And when Vice President Harris put out her first ad, as you may know, her first campaign ad, it was called Freedom. and so we were not the only ones. We should give credit to Mark Riddle over at with his shop, who's talked about this. So we're not the only ones who are talking about this. But I think that there really is a recognition that freedom is such a dividing line here. The Republicans have been talking about freedom. They've been talking about that as a word. But yet, if you look at their agenda, whether it's banning books or wanting someone in the exam room with you when you're making a very private healthcare decision, freedom is really not what their agenda adds up to. So if you contrast that, as we were saying, and we did a lot of that at the convention, we did a lot of that in our messaging guide. If you contrast that notion of freedom with actually an agenda that is about freedom, which is from every, and not, again, I think we talk about freedom a lot and we think about freedom of choice, which is absolutely on the ballot. And we talked a lot about that. I thought that was one of the most powerful things at the convention was the horrific stories of women and men who have been, and their husbands or their partners who have been going through these terrible experiences, healthcare crises made because we've had this overturning of Roe that the Trump, precipitated with his Supreme Court nominee. So to contrast that and to hear from real people whose lives have been incredibly affected was so powerful. But so, we think of freedom of choice, but there's so many other pieces to the freedom agenda, as Rachel was mentioning, whether it's freedom from gun violence. We talked a lot about that at the convention, freedom to pursue an economic path for you and your family and to prosper, to be free from lead in your pipes, right? All of these things. So I think it's a great frame actually for Democrats, and I'm so happy that we thought so early, as you mentioned, and I'm so happy that looks like where the Harris Walls ticket is going, is to just keep hammering that home.
Yeah, I mean, when we had Congresswoman Kuster on the podcast, she really articulated how important it was, especially with the attacks on the Capitol and, a sort of fundamentally anti-freedom, anti-democracy movement in this country, and how important it was to counter that.
I love the framing of freedom, and particularly given that the former president running for president again literally wants to be a dictator. So I think it's important that we call out freedom and that we call out the rule of law, our Constitution, and how we as New Democrats, as New Deal leaders in our communities, approach the role of government. We believe in our institutions, starting from the ground up, starting from voters. We just had our first in the nation presidential primary last week in New Hampshire, where voters turned out because they know that their voice makes a difference. And we can't let the cynicism of this new era erase that level of engagement. I think it's critically important. So we talk about a freedom agenda, partly because our freedoms are threatened.
Let's talk about choice, because we had Ilana Rubel from Idaho talk about the devastating impact it's had on the whole healthcare system in anti-choice legislation has had in Idaho. But we also have Anna Tovar and other folks from Arizona who are leading initiatives that will hopefully enshrine the right to choice. Rachel, on the floor, what was the feeling around freedom and choice, and especially in the swing states, how it can be used to mobilize voters and enshrine basic rights?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's becoming such a key issue. Like you mentioned, Arizona recently announced that there will be an abortion measure on their ballot this year, which is a really big deal coming off of that Supreme Court ruling back in the spring. I think people are realizing that reproductive rights and freedom, for some, like I think of them as two peas in a pod. They make a lot of sense together for me, but they really go deeper than just like the bodily autonomy, right? I think Ilana Rubel spoke to this really well when we had a discussion with her, as far as like how the attacks on abortion have like really bad ripple effects just across the board. In particular, you're seeing Idaho's economy really struggle. So not only are you restricting people's bodily autonomy and their freedom to make their own decisions, but you're restricting people's opportunities to get basic health care. You're restricting their opportunities to pursue economic opportunities in their state, right? She spoke about how corporations are now pulling out of Idaho as a viable place, just because they know their employees would not be interested in living somewhere with such draconian abortion laws. So I think, it's so important that women and people who can have children have the right to make those decisions about their body. Bodily autonomy is so key. But I think what we really saw on stage at the DNC and what we saw in our conversations on this messaging series was that idea that, these attacks on reproductive rights really do have impacts on our economic freedom and our freedoms across the board.
And it goes beyond just recruiting healthcare professionals. Companies like Micron in the semiconductor space are routinely either losing employees or failing to recruit needed employees because of our kooky social laws. And people are saying, I'm just sick of the book bans. I'm sick of the attacks on the LGBTQ community. I feel I can't live here because I have a gay kid. Or, it's really it's causing a lot of backlash, I think, to the business community. So they're starting to engage. I think there was a little bit of lag time because this crazy social stuff's been happening for some time, and they've only started really waking up. I think post Dobbs was a real wake up call when they realized, oh wait, our employees won't have doctors to go to. People who are thinking of having kids don't feel it's safe to live in Idaho anymore. It's a problem for businesses in every sector.
Can I just add to that? I totally agree. And I also, one of the chants you would have heard if you were listening to the convention was that was said a lot was "we're not going back." And I feel like that was another theme throughout the convention on a number of fronts, but certainly on choice and on women's rights generally. And I thought that was, to me, elections really are about who can paint a bigger picture for the future that people buy into, right? That people, an aspirational agenda that people want to be part of. And so that to me was a really, that theme of "we're not going back" was really central to the convention. And I think it's also inherent in many of the conversations that we had on this podcast and for our messaging document. The other thing I wanted to point out before we leave the choice idea is I was struck by some of the conversations we had. Rachel's right about kind of the getting a taste and a feel for what was really happening on the ground with these bans that have now been in effect because of the overturning of Roe, but also the practical advice we got from people. So I'm thinking about the conversation we had with Jesse Ferguson, where he said, where he said, don't talk about Dobbs. People don't know what Dobbs is, but most people know what Roe is. So talk about the overturning of Roe, not the Dobbs decision. Just some really practical, tangible things that that candidates or elected officials or just people in general can talk about as we head into 2024 November to make sure we're making the case as effectively as we can.
The biggest thing to do is, or two things. One, make sure we're anchoring our argument in the fact that Republicans overturned Roe versus Wade. They took away this right. So before we get into what we're going to do, they took away this right. There's a shocking number of people that are still unsure about that. And when we're talking about it, it's 16% of voters that don't know what Roe versus Wade is. It is 60% that don't know what the Dobbs decision is. So let's not make it harder for ourselves by overcompensating. They overturned Roe versus Wade. They took away the right to an abortion. They decided that politicians should make this decision instead of women, family, doctors, and nurses.
And I want to talk, because you briefly mentioned it, but I think it's worth noting this convention was really about passing a torch, right, from one generation to the next. And the New Deal has been fundamental in being cultivating the next generation of leaders. I'd like to think this podcast does a great job of highlighting how lucky we are to have these leaders across the country. And in addition to the potential vice presidential candidates, we recently had Austin Davis, Lieutenant Governor of Pennsylvania, on, Tanya Miller from Georgia on the podcast. Talk about what it felt like to both pass the torch within the party, but then also you can feel it really appeal to young voters, which are going to be critical this November to not only the presidential election, but to the House and Senate and state houses and beyond.
Yeah, I mean, I think from the convention, passing the torch was such a key part of the conversations we were having at the convention. One, giving President Biden the credit he's due for a lot of the amazing things that he accomplished in his administration. And yes, recognizing that Kamala Harris brings this new energy, which is really exciting to this year's election. But yeah, I like what you said about as far as, we're passing the torch to younger generations. We have a lot of people who are going to be voting in their first presidential election this year around the country, which is super exciting. And so what appeals to a younger voter might not be the same thing that appeals to voters who have voted many times before. I want to be careful saying that because I know Olivia Julianna made a really great point on our podcast that you should be, talking to young voters like they are an entirely different species. Like a lot of the concerns are the same. I think one really insightful piece of advice that we got from Sam Youngman was as far as you do want to reach out to young voters maybe in these new and innovative ways, but like older voters and voters who have voted before, young people want results. I think passing the torch is just one part of it. I think passing the torch talks about bringing that momentum in, that energy. But what happens after you pass the torch? You still have to deliver and find ways to deliver for these voters who, kind of were not as enthusiastic about this election a month ago.
Can I just add something on that? I totally agree. And it was super fun, by the way, to see Olivia Julianna for people who were watching the convention, who was on our podcast. Listeners will remember. But she spoke at the convention. She talked about young voters, and I think got to introduce Stevie Wonder, if I'm not mistaken, which I think was probably a lot of fun. But there was absolutely no doubt that young people are fired up about Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, and that was super exciting to see. And I think the DNC, frankly, did a really good job of engaging young people, not just as delegates or other ways, but like they had content creators in. I think for the first time, they really were very thoughtful about making sure that young voices were heard, young voices were engaged. But one thing that I wanted to point out about Olivia Julianna's comments when she was with us was also the point that she made about the fact that if you think about what young people care about, the economy is front and center. And that was another theme, important theme. I mean, like actually, like with right up there with freedom was focusing on kitchen table issues. I think when Olivia was talking about young people, she was pointing out about things like being able to afford your housing, being able to think about your student debt, right? All of these things that affect young people across the board. And I thought that I think that the campaign did at the convention, but also is doing a great job. Obviously, the vice president, her first substantive speech was an economic agenda that she put out that was focused on lowering costs for working families and for all people. And
I've been screaming from the rooftops to anyone who will listen to me, whether it's a congressional campaign or the White House, we need a concentrated youth economic agenda. There's no reason why at this point that hasn't been something that's been a pillar of Democratic campaigning, especially coming into an election cycle where the youth vote could be the difference in a lot of these key states and a lot of these key races. I think, when we think about, okay, well, how are we talking about the economy to young people? The only two things I can think of is student debt forgiveness and the minimum wage. The overwhelming majority of us are currently in college. That's great. If we forgive student debt, the Supreme Court's kind of held it up, but what are we doing to remedy the deeper illness that's causing that? Because if we just forgive student debt and we don't ban predatory lending practices or teach young people that there are other alternatives to going straight into university. I went to community college. I got Pell Grants because of the American Rescue Plan. I know a lot of young people who have foregone college to go to trade schools. There are other options out there.
I think, that was a theme to me that was resonating throughout the conversations we had. So not just with young people, but I was super struck, and Ryan, I'd be curious about your thoughts on this, with Mike Madrid in particular, who was so unequivocal about this, who was like, if as people, our voters, our listeners will remember, we had Mike on to talk about his book, The Latino Century, which was so eye-opening about how the vast growth of Latino population in this country and the different ways multi-generational people will think about their country and what matters to them. But what he said kind of at the top was if you want to reach Latino voters, you got to have an economic message. You got to have an aspirational economic message. And so that really has struck with me, and I think that I'm excited to see that the campaign is embracing that and understanding that and really putting out very thoughtful concrete ways that they're going to make housing more affordable, lower costs, make sure people have a pathway to good jobs. So, you talked to a lot of these people too, Ryan. What's your sense on the economic piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think it should be extremely gratifying for the New Deal, who's advocated for so long a focus on the economy, and in fact has moved really consequential legislation through that with big investments in infrastructure, in small business and energy and opportunity. And then the party somehow, after we passed it, never really talked about it again. And so I think your relentless focus on keeping that top of mind and top of the agenda has been really essential. I think one of the interesting things was, Mike Madrid did talk to us about the importance of this, of opportunity, and especially opportunities as it's tied to housing. He talks about how 20% of Latino men are directly employed in the housing field, whether that's in construction or mortgages, real estate, or other adjacent economic activity. And if you don't have a pro-housing agenda, it's going to be very hard to win those men and then win those swing states. And so I thought it was extraordinary at the convention that you had several speakers, including Barack Obama, being super clear that building more homes and faster had to be an essential part of the Democratic Party's agenda. And I thought it hit exactly on what Mike has been talking about in his book and on our podcast over the past couple months. And I'm hoping it resonates in those swing states as people see this as the party that is for economic opportunity and for development, and that's done in a smart and thoughtful way.
So the question becomes, well, how? What does he need to do? The first is, in terms of the centrality of economic issues, I brought up housing for a very specific reason. There needs to be a Marshall Plan for Latino housing and home ownership. Literally, call it that, specifically that, and use all of the strength and substance of the federal government to bring that to bear. Look, there's not a whole lot of control the president has over interest rates, but you can certainly use first-time homebuyer tax credits, for example. You can certainly use deduction abilities on taxes. You can do federal credits for down payment assistance. There's a whole arsenal of things that you can use specifically to first-time home buyers that will disproportionately benefit Latinos getting into the system.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I talk about one other thing that just struck me at the convention, and I think that was also apparent as we talked to people over the last several months, which is this idea that always when you think about elections, but really in this particular moment, how important it is to build a broad coalition from the middle out, and that we need to be welcoming people of all stripes, right? And I mean, the vice president could not have been clearer about that in her speech. I thought, by the way, and I thought, as I mentioned top, I've been to a lot of conventions. That was probably my favorite convention speech ever. I mean, it was so powerful. It was so on point. She did such a phenomenal job. And it was, both introduced her in a new way to voters, but also really painted this picture of America about what unites us and brought this breath of fresh air after having felt like our politics for so long has been about dividing us and about what's different and how we're divided. And she made this very compelling case about, I want to be a president for all people, that we're all in this together, that, there's more that unites us and divides us, all of those things. But maybe what I hope people had a chance to see, in addition to her great speech on this, they did a phenomenal job of putting Republicans on the stage in a real way. I mean, I thought, for me, two of the most compelling speeches of the whole week were Adam Kinzinger's speech on Thursday right before the vice president. He had a real nice primetime spot. People will remember former Congressman Kinzinger as the other Republican who was on the January 6th committee with Liz Cheney. And his message was, look, I never thought I would ever be speaking at a Democratic convention, but I've been here, and I've got to tell you, these people love our country too. These people are patriots too, and it's and kind of echoed Jeff Duncan, who was the former lieutenant governor of Georgia the night before, who literally said, voting for Kamala Harris if you're a Republican does not make you a Democrat; it makes you a patriot. And those two speeches together, I thought, were so indicative of kind of this idea of a big tent, that there are, there's a real contrast and a vision for the country, the one that is talking about joy and freedom and opportunity, and one that is seeking to divide us and to appeal to our worst instincts and our worst angels. And so I thought that was really, for me, super, super powerful. And as I said, it echoed some of the things we heard on our podcast, in particular, people like Simon Rosenberg talking about reclaiming patriotism, right? And that we can be the party of that puts country first, as Rachel was saying earlier, or Zeb Smathers, who talked very eloquently on our at an event we did about how reaching rural voters and people that don't agree with you, and how you listen and how you make space and room for those people. You don't have to agree on everything. So I thought that was another, for me, a really big theme, both for the convention, but also the conversations we've been having for months now.
MAGA's information strategy is not just about misinforming and putting disinformation. It's about pumping negative sentiment into our discourse every day. They want us to feel bad about our country, our democracy, our leaders, our institutions, each other. They want us to feel bad because when the country has failed, that's when radical solutions then come forward. That's how authoritarians gain power. Part of our job is to counter that negative sentiment with positive sentiment, is to talk about the greatness and the goodness of America, to talk about the good works of the Democratic Party and Joe Biden. We need to become unyielding in our defense of this remarkable country. And I think I often talk about how at my site, Hopium, what I'm trying to do is to give Americans permission to love their country again. And I think if we operate out of a deep sense of love of country, I think we're going to kick their ass in this election, because love of country, patriotism, is the antidote to nationalism. And I think you heard it last night with Joe Biden. I mean, that was a deeply patriotic speech. He's going deep into the core issues around freedom and patriotism and love of country that I think are the kryptonite for the authoritarian right in the United States. And so I think all the tools, we have the tools to go do this. I think one of the things we have to recognize is that, the louder, think of yourself as a member of a chorus that's singing very loudly. You're just one voice, but the louder each of us are, the louder the chorus gets.
The thing I'd add is that not only were we talking to the middle, listening to the middle, reflecting on their values and concerns, but we were doing it with plain language, right? And this is something that we've heard over and over again. Sam Youngman on this podcast talked about it. Jesse Ferguson talked about it. Like, you have to be able to talk in a way that people feel like it's a normal conversation. It's not full of acronyms and unclear words. And so I thought the speeches, particularly the vice president's speech and Tim Walz's speech, so clear and straightforward, really a conversation. And I feel like that's going to be a key to victory, is to just be able to be seen as a party, a patriotic party, and also a party of people who can just talk to you in the language that you understand, that we all understand, about where this country's headed.
Yeah, I think Karen Finney was another person we talked to, CNN commentator, who talked really powerfully about that as well, about talking about the price of groceries and just acknowledging, people's struggle to and what Democrats are doing, acknowledging it, and then talking about what Democrats are doing to bring prices down.
There's two sides to this, because the other thing about these kitchen table issues that I think we have to acknowledge is those also go to just generally how we feel about our lives and our place in our lives, in terms of, do I have breathing room? Or am I, when you are trying to decide between which bills to pay, or I just opened a can of something the other day, and it was like half full, but the same price. And I thought, I was annoyed about that. And so I think it's as much talking about the issues, but acknowledging the anxiety and the pain that people are feeling and how that makes them feel about their lives in a fulsome way. So a lot of it, I think, is just, again, having these conversations in as clear a way as possible, but in the ways that we experience all of these issues in our day-to-day lives.
But I wanted to just jump in to follow up on what you said. I don't think we've talked yet enough about Tim Walz. Tim Walz is amazing. And oh my gosh, like, from the optics of it, the love from his family. I'm sure people saw on TV, they brought his neighbor out to introduce him. He's talking about, don't you just want someone in your neighborhood to pull you out of a snowbank? If you're in Minnesota, I guess. I live in California, we don't get snow, but so I guess this is a thing. And he's like, that's my neighbor was Tim Walz, right? Who literally brought me out of a snowbank. And then having his football team, come forward and be on this stage. So, I mean, to your point, Ryan, just about plain language, here is a person who just literally speaks in the plainest language. You feel like it could be your teacher, your neighbor, your next, you're someone you just meet in the grocery store, who like really has a good grasp of those kind of, Amy Klobuchar, I think, talked about introducing him to about, kind of his common sense Midwest values. But we talked a lot about, from strategists on our podcast, about the need to do that. And here is someone who actually embodies it and lives it, and is so genuine, authentic in who he is. He's such an asset for that ticket. And I didn't know him very well at all going into this, but I mean, man, am I a fan now.
Couldn't agree more.
Agreed. Agreed.
Rachel, I mean, so we are heading into September, October, and then we're going to have an election, the most consequential of elections. What do you see as this podcast and as the role that the New Deal will be playing heading into November?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that in honorable profession, I think New Deal are going to remain crucial. I think there is tremendous momentum at the top of the ticket right now, which is phenomenal to see. But we can't expect that momentum to just trickle down. We actually have to do something to make sure that that energy and that excitement is happening in these down ballot races. I think that's where, you can look back on our conversations with leaders in particular, with our state and local elected officials in communities across the country. They're really going to be the messengers on this micro level. They're going to be the ones meeting with voters every day. As we're talking about, I think we owe a huge debt to the Midwest in this election. I think that doing things the Midwestern way might just win us this election. But we talk about the values that Tim Walz represents as far as speaking in plain language, but who's actually going to be doing that speaking? A lot of the times it's going to be your state representative, your state senator, your city council member, your school board member. It's going to be the people that you know every day. One of my favorite things that we talk about on this podcast, I think typically we talk about it a ton with mayors, is their run-ins in the grocery stores with their constituents. I think that those little moments where we're going to have our state and local elected leaders interacting with their neighbors, not just their constituents, but their neighbors, their kids' teachers, their kids' coaches, their friends. Those are really going to make or break, I think, the momentum on these local races that, could make a really big impact. And they'll have an impact on races closer to the top of the ticket that aren't president. I think they'll have a big impact on people running for senator, people running for House. I do think that we're looking at the state and local movement that, has to channel that energy from the top and bring it across the board. I'm looking forward to even more conversations over the next 2.5 months with leaders who are doing just that and sharing their strategies for reaching out to friends and neighbors.
Amen. Democracy and freedom will not be just determined in the White House. They will be determined in city council chambers, school boards, state legislatures, and beyond. And as always, the New Deal will be there supporting the best and the brightest at every level of government in order to bring our values and policies that improve people's lives to bear. Thank you all for joining us today. Rachel, it's wonderful having you.
Thank you.
On screen, and stick around for more great conversations about the future of this country on An Honorable Profession.
An Honorable Profession is a New Deal Leaders podcast. Thanks to the team at New Deal for producing this episode. We encourage you to bring honor to public service, and because we keep things honorable, no tax dollars are used in the making of this podcast.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.